The last time we talked, AFRICOM was engaged with some 38 nations here on the continent. Has this changed?
It's evolving. I think since the last time I saw you, there's a new nation in Africa, the Republic of South Sudan, so it's changed in that regard. And certainly our relationship with a new Libya is different than it was a year or so ago. So those things continue to change, and I think it's just reflective of the constant change in Africa.
How many countries are you having relations with now?
Most. There are 53 in the area of responsibility, and there are only a handful that we do not have some form of military-to-military engagement with.
The administration right now is strongly pushing for economic development throughout Africa, saying this will help to build democracies. How does AFRICOM put this into practice?
We're part of an overall plan in sub-Saharan Africa. Recently, the President released what's called a Presidential Policy Directive for sub-Saharan Africa that outlines the overarching U.S. policy with sub-Saharan African partners. And so certainly economic development is a major component of that, but there's also a security component. And there's an understanding, certainly in the U.S. government and in African governments as well, that the two are interrelated. You can't really have good, strong economic development if there's not security and stability.
Terrorism is also very evident in many regions in Africa. What, if anything, is AFRICOM's response to terrorism?
We have significant responsibilities. In fact, I would say this is my highest priority. As a Geographic Combatant Command, AFRICOM's responsibility is to protect America, Americans, and American interests from threats that emerge from the continent of Africa. And at present, the most dangerous of those threats are transnational terrorist organizations.
So how do you combat terrorism?
Well, fundamentally in Africa, we think the best way to do that is help African nations develop their own capability, while others in the U.S. government, the State Department, USAID, Commerce, Treasury, Justice, and many others address some of the underlying causes that might contribute or establish an environment in which terrorists might find an opportunity to operate. We focus on the security and stability ends. And we think it is important that we help African nations develop their own capabilities to provide for their own security, and also to begin the capability to contribute more expansively to regional security.
And how's that going?
It's mixed, frankly. There are some places where the results are quite positive. I would cite Somalia as an example of that. And a year ago, I wouldn't have said that, but the performance of African militaries in Somalia, and the U.S. government has a piece in training and equipping them, but their performance in Somalia has been extraordinary, and they really have degraded the capability of al-Shabaab, an al-Qaeda affiliated organization operating in Somalia, where most of the area of Somalia is now not receptive to al-Shabaab. They certainly still have some strong points, but greatly diminished over the last year because of the role of Africans. In other places, it's quite the opposite, and I would cite Mali as an example of the opposite, where now about 2/3 of that country, for a variety of reasons, is essentially outside the control of the interim government in Mali and is largely controlled by transnational terrorist organizations.
Part of what you refer to there with Mali is what we would call the winds of change that are sweeping across the continent. Some are more positive, some are more negative. Governments are transforming. People are beginning to speak out. How do these changes impact what you do?
Anytime there's a strong presence, a strong role of a government that is selected by the people, it makes it easier for the militaries and for gendarmerie and the others to operate. What we try to do is, through our partnership with African militaries and other security forces, is to say, listen, what we're really trying to do is help you build security forces that are not only tactically capable, but forces that are genuinely responsive to legitimate civilian control, that operate according to the rule of law, and see themselves as servants of the people of that nation. And we're seeing that over and over again, and certainly you see that here in Botswana.
You've said many times before that the geographic expanse of Africa builds very unique challenges. Every country is different, every region is different. How does this challenge, complicate, or benefit the building of military relationships?
It complicates it in a way because of the diversity and the complexity of the African Union's regional organizations. And we're trying increasingly to operate with those regional organizations and to follow the African Union's structure. But inside each of those organizations, so here, the Southern African Development Community, SADC, has big nations, powerful militaries, South Africa, and small nations, Lesotho, you know, with not much military capability, and then a whole range of capabilities in between. There are nations with whom we have very, very strong U.S. relations, and some that we don't. And so, you know, crafting a way ahead inside the diversity of that regional organization can be a challenge.
How important are the relationships that you're building?
It's all about relationships. It's the ability to talk to a chief of defense or a minister of defense, in some cases heads of state, to convey to them what it is that we're trying to do, make sure they understand that we're not going to do anything, we don't want to do anything that they don't want us to do, and really to try to convey what I think is the most important word, and that is partnership. And a partnership is a relationship which benefits all participants. Again, this exercise, Southern Accord, is a great example of that. There's no doubt in my mind, from talking to the soldiers, airmen and Marines who are here from the United States, that they leave this exercise better able to accomplish their missions, the variety of missions that they have for having participated in this. And I believe, in talking to the senior Botswanan officers, that their forces have mutually benefited. That's what we're really trying to do.
There have been reports that DOD, especially the Army, is moving to align troops and units with global regions. How will this help you?
The most important thing that does for us at Africa Command is it provides us predictability. Because of the levels of forces, particularly Army and Marine forces that have been committed to Iraq and Afghanistan over the past several years, it's been difficult to get the forces that are necessary for exercises, for military-to-military engagements, for training, with any degree of predictability. Now the Chief of Staff Army has taken a significant step forward by saying to his Army component commander, my Army component commander in Vicenza, U.S. Army Africa, says, here's a brigade that I'm going to make available to you to use however you deem necessary for the next just about a year. That's a hugely beneficial opportunity for Major General Donahue to have, so he can now talk with his counterparts in Africa with the certainty that he can now say, he can now agree. It says, yes, I will provide this force. If you need engineers, I've got engineers. You need intelligence folks, I can do that. You need signal folks, I can do that. You need logistics folks, I can do that. Previously, before the Chief of Staff Army made this commitment, the Army Africa commander could only say, thank you very much, I understand your requirement. Let me go back now to the Army and see if I can get that. And that process was unsatisfying.
If you get this brigade, does that mean you won't be using National Guard and Reserve component anymore?
Absolutely not. We'll continue to rely very, very heavily on National Guard and Reserve component from all of the services. The state partnership program is one of the most important tools that we have in our collective kit bag. And we see that certainly here between North Carolina and Botswana, where it's hugely powerful. I have asked the Chief of the National Guard Bureau to allow us to grow more state partnership programs in Africa. I'd like to get 2 more this year and maybe 2 more next year, and then see how that might unfold.
Do you still encounter those who feel that America, and by extension AFRICOM, has a clandestine agenda for Africa?
Absolutely. It's in the newspapers today in Botswana.
Seriously?
About the secret American base, and that the United States is using Africa Command to kind of, you know, establish some kind of clandestine military presence here, and somehow we're manipulating the Botswanans to allow us to do that. So yes, those kind of far-fetched ideas seem to persist.
Do you ever see a day when those stories will stop? I mean, can we do anything to change that perception?
I don't know that they'll stop, but there are things that we can do, and the first thing we can do is to be open and honest and upfront about what we do. So today, at this exercise here in Botswana, you'll see officers and civilian officials from the Southern African Development Community, from South Africa, from Lesotho, from Zimbabwe, from Angola, from Namibia, from Malawi, from all the regional countries, and say, this is what we do. We're not hiding anything. You can, you know, talk to our soldiers, talk to the Botswanan soldiers, and that's all we can do. But I don't spend a whole lot of time worrying about the people who have time to spread these kinds of rumors.
Now, a lot of DOD is facing budget cuts. Is AFRICOM?
Sure, yeah, we'll take some budget cuts. We have to. It would be irresponsible for us to not take, you know, some share of the reduction.
But from what you're saying, you're amplifying your efforts.
We can do this. We can be smart about how we do this. That just as a technical matter, you know, the Army Brigade that's going to come here, you know, generally those aren't AFRICOM dollars that fund for that. Those are other service dollars. But for AFRICOM, most of our money is spent on personnel, particularly civilian pay issues, and on some training and exercises, conferences and travel. We can be smarter about how we do that and still achieve the effect we need to achieve, and account for some reductions in our budgets.
What would make your mission more successful?
Some of the authorities that we have for a variety of engagement activities are very narrowly defined within the Department of Defense and some within the Department of State. In fact, some of them are so-called dual key, where both DOD and Department of State have to approve. It's sometimes for a large exercise such as this, we have to cobble together a number of different authorities in order to get to the end state. So I think there's some work that we could probably do in both departments to streamline that process, make things a little more agile, a little more responsive, and I think there's a good sense, at least within Department of Defense officials who I deal with, that there's some we can do in that regard.
People back home will be watching this. What would you have them know about AFRICOM that perhaps they don't know already?
I think the big question often is, why AFRICOM? Why does the United States need a military command that's focused on Africa? And I would say that there's a lot of reasons. I could easily say there's a billion reasons. There's a billion people who live on this continent. Do we really want to? Is it in the United States' best interest to neglect a continent of a billion people? I don't think so. There are governments that are supportive of our efforts, some that are not so supportive of our efforts, whether they're diplomatic or economic or security. We probably want to make sure that we have open lines of communication with them. We know that we have, as global economies, as global security matters affect more and more of the world, what happens in Africa affects us in the United States. We've seen that in the bad side in terms of people trying to get into the United States with explosive devices originating in Africa. On the good side, we see economic trade growing. Lots of the world's fastest growing economies are here. So I think there's a whole host of reasons of why America and Americans should care about advancing our interests in Africa, and the security is one component of an overall U.S. government approach, and we're glad to do that. We do it in a way that is in the defense strategy is described, is directed to me, is to do this in a light footprint and innovative way. And that's what we try to do. So we don't need big forces. We don't want big forces in Africa. We want tailored forces for specific purposes, for specific periods of time, to partner with our African counterparts, and that seems to work pretty effectively.
If you had a wish list, what would top that wish list?
That's a great question. What would I want more of?
Basic answers or money, manpower?
I mean, probably at the top of the list would be more intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability. The wide expanses here, just to be able to help ourselves and to help our partners cover some of those the troubled border areas, trafficking routes of illicit drugs and weapons, and illicit trafficking of persons. Certainly the networks that terrorist organizations use. A better ability to collect upon those, I think, would be at the top of the list.
And then one final question. There are many nations in Africa that we do not have military relations with, that perhaps we should, as a way to stop any bad behavior. How do you go about working that challenge? Because you have to work with the State Department that decrees who you can communicate with, right?
Sure. I mean, the State Department has the lead for United States foreign policy. And so, we're a part of that. We're a tool in that kit bag. But it is, I think, through the regional organizations is one way to have some effect. Another is to look downstream a bit, if you will. So, for example, again, a couple of years ago, would anyone have thought that we would have the relationship we have with Libya today? I don't think so. And if someone saw that coming, I'm not aware of it. So we also have to be postured to take advantage of and be ready to establish relationships when time and circumstance is right. And there's certainly things constantly changing across the continent that will make those opportunities available.
General Ham, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Gail. Thanks.